but I believe in women's toilets for women. I don't want my daughter going into a toilet where, a man might go into. I think there's a sensible, common sense approach where you can be strong and staunch in your values, still be lovely and accepting of all those around you who feel differently or who identify differently.
Well, welcome everyone to today's episode of 7 Minute Expert. I think you're going to really like today's episode. We talk about Australian politics, Trump's speeches in the Middle East, feminism, transgenders, and women's sports, and all the rest of it. I think it's going to be really enjoyable. Please make sure to like and subscribe. I'm Gideon Askowitz, and this is 7 Minute Expert. Welcome to today's episode of 7 Minute Expert. I'm Gideon Askowitz, and today we have Erin Molan. Erin Molan is a very famous news anchor in Australia. She has done about 2 decades on the news. She was on Sky News on Australia until recently, covering public affairs, and before that, she covered sports. So today we're going to talk a little bit about some of her passions. So she's very passionate about the Middle East and the conflict in Israel and the broader Middle Eastern structure, as well as the persecution of Christians throughout the Middle East, something that you all know that I've discussed at length with, especially with Reverend Johnny Moore at the International Fellowship for Christians and Jews, which you all should check out and donate to. So I'm hoping to get into a little bit of that and maybe some other cultural issues that are quite the topics of the day. So Erin, thank you so much for coming on.
Gideon, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be with you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
It's really wonderful to have you. I've been watching your work for about a year now or so. It's not every day that Australians come up on the American newsfeed, but because of the power of Twitter, I guess now we're seeing people from all over the world. So it's been really wonderful to see how you've been advocating for what's been going on in the Middle East. I saw that just yesterday you posted a video about Trump's summit in Saudi Arabia, which was, I thought, quite captivating, a very powerful and interesting speech where he tried playing both sides on the isolationist front. I was wondering, could you share your 2 cents on that? And then we'll get into some of the other things.
Yeah, I think I'd preface anything by saying it is a fascinating time, isn't it? Particularly to be invested in this region, as we all should be. And I say that in full acknowledgement that there is a lot of pain, a lot of suffering. There's a lot at stake, would be the right way to put it. Donald Trump is a very interesting person. A very interesting man. And I mean, from week to week, I find myself fist pumping one day and the next day going, oh God, it's that kind of, but that's who he is. And no one will ever perfectly align with every single thing that you think should be happening or with every single outcome that you want. But, I think I've watched and listened to Donald Trump enough, and particularly over the last, it was 100 days, a couple of weeks back, I've seen enough to still have faith in what he is doing. But my gosh, sometimes the ways in which he goes about getting there are enough to scare the hell out of everyone who cares about the things that we do deeply. The speech was, for starters, from someone who uses words for a living and writes a lot of monologues. It was a brilliantly written and delivered speech. Whoever wrote that speech did a brilliant job, regardless of whether you agree with the basis of it or not. You're right. It was some healthy combination of no intervention, isolationism, peace, the way it was all woven in. It's very popular in the Middle East. That it's being shared over and over and over in a lot of Middle Eastern social media. The credit that he's giving to them for what they have built, as opposed to it being the result of Western intervention, was quite a fascinating point to make. And in many ways, he's right. But of course, we also know that a lot of the ways that they have built things has been via methods that we wouldn't deem appropriate in Western civilization, with human rights abuses and that kind of thing. It would be such a hard job to do in terms of balancing everything. And, dialogue matters in every way, shape or form. And my dad taught me that many, many years ago. I would love to not have to speak to people whom I believe are evil, but that doesn't work in the world. Dialogue matters when you are trying to get outcomes for your people. So I understand that aspect of it, but gosh, it's a hard ride sometimes. It really is, watching what he's doing over there, particularly given the involvement that Qatar has when it comes to Hamas, October 7, the celebration shots of Hamas leadership during October 7, whilst it was still being carried out in Qatar. There are things that I am immensely uncomfortable with in terms of how they operate, what they support, the particular ideology that appears to exist there. But I'm also big enough and old enough and ugly enough to understand that diplomacy is a complex beast, and Donald Trump said America first, and he's doing what he believes to be in the best interest of America.
So I want to pick up on 2 things that you said maybe. So there was the dealing with people with whom you don't want to deal with, which is obviously the nature of diplomacy, especially in the Middle East. And then there's the nature of the Qatari government itself. So on the nature of dealing with people that are perhaps unsavory at best, do you think that the recent move to lift the sanctions on Syria, do you think that that's overall is a good move, especially with the slaughter of Christians and Druze that we've seen there? Is that warranted in your view?
Look, again, so complex, and I am so glad I'm not in a position to be making any of these decisions. Look, I think what's happening in Syria at the moment is disgraceful. It is sickening, and I've covered it a fair bit on my channel. I note that all those who march in the streets, the pro-Hamas flag waving, caring about innocence, don't care so much about innocence in Syria, which is obviously always an interesting point. Lani's a really interesting character. You know, I had a real crack at Emmanuel Macron this week because he welcomed him with open arms, red carpet, handshake. He's a hero. But, you know, Netanyahu, gosh, no, we'd arrest him. He's not welcome here. So the issue I have is when you are hypocritical in your attempt to be morally righteous. That's the issue I have. Trump, of course, should meet with everyone. He absolutely should. If he can, then he should. There are outcomes that might improve the existence of all people. Absolutely do it. But what I can't stand is this cherry picking, i.e. from Macron, who's shaking hands with a former slash whatever he is now terrorist who is still in control of a regime that is slaughtering innocents. And then the next day, he's there with Zelensky and 4 or 5 other European leaders trying to fight evil and come together. I just think the hypocrisy and the lack of clear thinking there, that's what annoys me more than anything else. So at least with Donald Trump, he's open to everyone and anything. And you know, you're either not going to have an outcome, you might have a good outcome, or you might have a bad outcome, but you're going to have an outcome with Donald Trump either way. So look, the sanctions, I'll leave that for other people to decide. You know, what I hope will come from it, given it's a decision that has been made, is that there will be incentive for him to clean things up for Jelani. There will be incentive for them to particularly, he mentioned, you know, potentially joining the Abraham Accords. He's mentioned things that might incentivize Jelani to want to be part of this world where Donald Trump is there and it's exciting and business opportunities. He wants people to invest in Syria, et cetera, et cetera. So look, if that awakens something different or new or helps Syria turn in another direction, that can only be a good thing. But I think they've just got to keep in mind what is happening at the moment. And anyone who is okay with what is happening to minority groups in Syria at the moment is not the kind of person that I would be trusting or respecting in any way. Doesn't mean I wouldn't deal with them. But you know, Trump is smarter than me, smarter than that. He knows that.
So what do you think is perhaps driving Emmanuel Macron's calculation that he's welcoming in Jelani? Because I couldn't help but think that it was kind of reminiscent of when the French welcomed in Ayatollah Khomeini. I'm like, this is the same image, different guy.
I just think, and not even so much the French, Macron himself is just, you know, I used to think Justin Trudeau was the weakest world leader. He's obviously now vacated his position. And I think Macron has come, you know, he was a close second for many years. But the arrogance in which he operates is something that I just find really difficult to stomach. And there's so many examples where he has attempted to play this moral card but then significantly fails in a complete other area. And that's the issue with him. I think he plays into what he thinks is popular or what he thinks will resonate with his people or what he thinks will resonate with those who have power within his own government. You know, so I think it was, you know, the new Argentinian president made some point after leadership, regardless of what form it is, whether you're prime minister, president, whatever it is, most people will not like you afterwards. And that's just part and part, you know, that's part of the job. Most people will dislike you for something you've done. So you might as well do what is right and what you believe in rather than attempting to play everyone and anything. And I think Macron could learn a lot from those words because he's the one that's got to go to bed with himself each night or with his wife, whatever he does.
I was going to say. With his kindergarten teacher.
Yes, that's well put. He's got to live with himself. And if he can go to bed at night thinking, God, Jelani's a good bloke and Al Khamenei, what great blokes. But Bibi, the guy who's currently fighting terrorists of that same ilk on 8 fronts and had people slaughtered on October 7 to the extent we haven't seen before since the Holocaust. Yeah, nah, not for me, mate. Not for me. Like, it's just, come on, you couldn't make it up.
I think that's very well put. It's an interesting note, though, about his wife. That's definitely been coming up lately.
I mean, sometimes I find myself deep diving and then I feel very shameful because I don't want to be critical of someone's looks or their age or but there's certain things that are let's just say, a little bit unique about that situation. That's probably the best word I can use without, offending.
I think perhaps I'll agree and we'll leave it there. You were alluding to before the Qatari influence, and you also did like a segment on that, talking about the jet. And as we had just discussed before I started recording, this is something I've been working on for almost 2 years now, in terms of Qatari funding in higher education. So I'm wondering, from a journalist perspective, how you view the role of Qatari journalism, really their state media, Al Jazeera, and how that maybe influences. We've seen the monetary influence that's better documented. How do you view as a journalist Al Jazeera?
Look, I don't view it as a journalist to be journalism, would be my direct response to that. And I think I've always been incredibly committed to not existing in an echo chamber. So it would be much easier for me to only follow accounts I agree with, to only watch Fox News, which I do vast majority of the time, to not expose myself to other things that I find fairly appalling, i.e. the BBC or CNN or Al Jazeera, which is right at the pointy end of that. I watch it all because I want to constantly challenge myself. I want to see what other people are saying. I want to see what those with whom I disagree are saying. So I watch a fair bit of Al Jazeera. And there is no way in hell that two people, i.e. me and them, can see the same situation in such complete opposition. And I'm not necessarily saying that in all instances where I see things differently from other people, I am right. That it's not the case. There are often perspectives, there is grey, there is context, there are a million different things. When it comes to terrorism, there is not. When it comes to the promotion of terrorism or the excusing of terrorism or the attempting to justify terrorism, which I feel like is threaded and weaved into every part of Al Jazeera's broadcast, it is not journalism. Journalism is giving people facts, giving people information, showing people things without a narrative woven in, without a slant put on it, without your own personal perspective put on it. I don't work as a journalist. I am a journalist. But even when I was on Sky, I was a commentator. I was an opinion host. My show was called Erin. It was my opinion. It was my job to get on that show and give people my opinion, my take. If I was doing the 6 p.m. news or the CNN news or the Fox News, they have opinion hosts, but they've also got news shows. Their only job is to give the news. And Al Jazeera, if you purport to be a news channel, doing a news program, then all you should be doing is telling people the news. They're not doing that. And they're not the only ones guilty of it. They are the extreme in terms of what they're putting out there. But it then, the issue is it then filters down to other networks who may not even be maliciously motivated, but they're consuming this kind of stuff. They're consuming stuff from Reuters, who is also meant to be an unbiased source of news that we can all rely heavily on to deliver the truth. Well, it's not. The headlines that come out of there are unbelievable, quoting Hamas, numbers when it comes to casualties, numbers that they themselves have revised multiple times and admitted they have got wrong or they have embellished significantly. But I look at, even in Australia, there are commercial networks who will start a news story, and I have no doubt that they're seeing clips from Al Jazeera, they're seeing clips on social media, they're seeing things that are shaping and shifting their narrative. But when the hostages were released and there was a prisoner exchange, the start of a Channel 9, Channel 10, Channel 7 story, one of them, I'm not going to be specific, here in Australia, began with shots of a man who'd come from Gaza, was released back to Gaza as part of this exchange, hugging his mum. His son was on his shoulders, and the narrator, the reporter, is saying, a family reunion, years in the making, and there's tears and everyone's happy. And it's true, right? Because it was a family reunion. What they're not telling you is that bloke blew up a bus 7 years ago and killed 6 kids. Like this is the issue with the reporting. So someone could look at that and say, well, what's wrong? It's true. They're emotional. It's a family reunion. He's been in Israel away for 6 years, and that's so beautiful. Mum's happy. Yeah, that's all true. But what you've got to tell your audience, because your audience is starting to feel empathy for him, is that the reason he was in a prison in Israel is because he blew up a bus. Then you have this kind of, and then here's some hostages released and let's move on. So if I'm just sitting at home and I'm not me, who's not, I read and I saturate myself with this stuff daily. I live and breathe it. It's my job. I'm fascinated by it. I care deeply. Most people don't have that luxury. Most people in Australia, far away or in different parts of the world, will look at something or hear something, and that will shape their entire narrative on a situation that they don't have the capacity to dig deeper into. And that's where the issue with Al Jazeera, I mean, they're preaching to the converted. In a lot of the nations in which they're broadcast, in the Middle East, everyone agrees with what they're saying and they think that that's true, and that's fine. But the danger is when it starts to reach outside of that, and people, unlike you or I, who aren't invested in this, and not because they don't care, but because they're single mums, 4 jobs,
there's no
cost of
time.
living crisis, no time. People don't have the time. So that's where The real danger lies when you are pretending that that is journalism when it's not.
I couldn't agree more. As you're saying that, I think a good way of terming it is perhaps emotional heuristics. That's just it's a
Yeah,
shortcut. You see one
really good
one
point.
piece of raw footage and you run with that, and that's your permanent narrative.
Even like a headline on the ABC in Australia, which is our national broadcaster. I was in the car, just a radio headline, and I always think single mother, 45, 4 kids, cost of living crisis, working. The headline was day 400 and something of Israel's illegal invasion of Gaza. And then you're getting out of the car and you're thinking, oh God, the illegal invasion. God, they're awful. Those poor people in Gaza. That is the head. How is that? They don't mention the fact that October 7 occurred, or there's hostages still there, or that Hamas have promised to continue killing Israelis and Jews at every possible opportunity. The first chance they get, they'll do it again. That's not there. It's illegal invasion of Gaza. And I just think, no wonder smart people who care are being conned by this stuff.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And to your point, you mentioned something about the affordability crisis in Australia. So I was wondering if I could ask you a little bit about the Australian domestic politics. I know you guys just had an election, and there's some troubling clips coming out of some of the parties in Australia. What did you make of the results? What should outsiders in America think of the Australian elections?
Well, look, it certainly wasn't the result that I was hoping for. And look, I've known Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister, for many years. I was a sports host, a rugby league host for many years. He's obsessed with rugby league. So prior to me becoming engaged politically and in commentary, we were, I'd say, quite good friends. It's a little different now. It's a little bit more complex now. Look, it's not the result that I was after, but I look at the coalition and I feel like they completely capitulated a couple of months out. They lost their backbone. They panicked. The polls prior to the start of the campaigning were very much in their favour. People were sick to death of the Labor government, of so many different elements of it. But then we saw an instance where they panicked and they lost their backbone, and they lost the ability to argue for what mattered and to stand for something that mattered. And they flip-flopped and they backflipped, and it was really...
What was that instance?
Oh, it's so many different, even little, they wanted people to go back to work, no more work from home for a lot of government departments because productivity was down, et cetera, et cetera. And then all of a sudden it became unpopular because a lot of people went, oh no, but we don't want to. And they went, oh, okay, well, we'll change it. No. And I just think, yes, I love that people can say, I came up with an idea in retrospect, or I've reflected on it, or I've had some feedback, and now I don't think it's the right idea. Great. But you can only do that once or twice before you lose all credibility. And people say, okay, well, what do you actually believe then? What do you actually stand for? And even, conservative values. And I know we probably move into this space off the back of this, but I am not a right-wing nut job at all. I am very progressive socially. I have a gay brother. I don't want anyone to ever feel like they don't belong. I'm never nasty just to be nasty about anyone at all. But I believe in, women's toilets for women. I don't want my daughter going into a toilet where, a man might go into. I think there's a sensible, common sense approach where you can be strong and staunch in your values, still be lovely and accepting of all those around you who feel differently or who identify differently. That's fine, while still maintaining a stance that is conservative. I just feel like they just completely panicked and it showed at the polls. I think people went, well, okay, I'm not particularly happy with this lot, but what's the alternative? What are they standing for? And unfortunately, the Jewish community here in Australia felt very, very let down by the Albanese government, by their response to October 7, by their response to domestic issues of anti-Semitism and not, bombings of synagogues and cars and graffiti and lots of awful bloody things. That's it. Nurses, exactly, who want to kill. I mean, you name it. Sydney Opera House, 2 days after, and we're seeing in front of our national monument, we're seeing people celebrating October 7, and we needed leadership in this country. But unfortunately, as we touched on earlier, the vast majority of people are not as engaged as you or I are, and because they don't have the luxury of being so. Cost of living, same as anywhere, people are struggling.
Do you think that maybe you plan on stepping into that leadership void in the future?
Look, I definitely not now. I think as a single mum with a 6-year-old, I've now managed to somehow create a life where I still work just as much as I ever have. I travel, I do a million things, but I'm the most present mother I've ever been, which is the greatest gift I'll ever give to myself and my daughter. And I think, look, if I was still with her father, then it might be a little bit easier to all of us go down to Canberra for, when Parliament's sitting or whatever. But I think at the moment it would just be, she's my priority. And I think, to be honest with you, I can make an impact, I think, and affect change much more effectively externally, to be honest with you. And I mean, even prior to this, I've got laws changed in Australia, the Online Safety Act. They called it, the Prime Minister called it Erin's Law. I feel like I can push for things and be a more powerful advocate externally, but there is certainly a part of me, particularly with Dad. I lost my dad. He was a senator a couple of years ago, a major general, then a senator. He's actually the most individually voted for Australian politician in history. He was a phenomenal human being, and there were a lot of things he was incredibly passionate about, which I've clearly inherited from him, which is international politics, national security, defence. And we don't have at the moment in Australia a national security strategy, which is crazy. You look at China and its intentions with Taiwan, you look at the Middle East, you look at Europe, you look at, I mean, it's not even about, having military preparedness. We don't have that. But fuel security, like we don't have a strategy. If China suddenly attempted to take Taiwan and World War III broke out, we're screwed. And so I think there's a part of me that wants to get in and finish what he started in some ways. So maybe down the track.
Well, we'll be cheering for you from over here. That's definitely for sure. You alluded to, and I think it's very important. Some of the conservative commentators in the U.S. have been talking about the way of compassionately dealing with social issues. So McBride, for example, is somebody who's been pretty integral in my thought development. He never is disparaging towards people who have other sexual preferences. And then there's the issue you said, but you have to divorce that from the transgender issue, which is something that I think you're alluding to. So,
and they're very different. They're very
different. Yes.
Most people who are gay, and I hate defining people by sexuality, but for this, instance,
Right.
It's required, don't like necessarily to be included in this. They are very different, incredibly different.
I think that's exactly right. So especially as somebody who covered the sports in Australia for a while, covering rugby, I'm assuming that the thought of having women competing against men in rugby, I mean,
you couldn't. So look, I'd put it this way for you. And there was an incident in America, I think it was maybe a National Security Committee or something, maybe a couple of months ago, where a transgender woman, and I want to make sure I get the terminology right because I'm not an expert in this field, and I try to be
you're talking about a man who identifies as a woman.
Yes, a man who identifies as a woman. And she was up speaking, and someone, and she, from what I could ascertain after the incident, he called her Mr. something. And she identifies as a woman, and another, I think it was a conservative.
Yeah, in the congressional hearing, McBride.
Yes. Okay. And so the issue I have with that is, and I a lot of people who would normally agree with me disagree with me on this, and that's fine. I'll always tell people exactly what I think. My whole perspective on this issue is there are legitimately people who fall into this category who are legitimately transgender, do not feel like they belong in what body they were given and born into, and that is okay, and they have every right to be happy and accepted and be exactly who they are. What they don't have the right to do is encourage children to move into that space. What they don't have the right to do is to make women feel uncomfortable. What they don't have the right to do is play against women in sport where they're going to potentially injure or harm. The issue I have is there was no, he may not want to call her Mrs. something. That's fine if he's not comfortable doing that. But he didn't have to call her Mr. something in a very nasty way.
So he actually, the congressional rules were amended that they have to, I believe.
They have to.
I believe that members need to be referred to in their official title, so by the sex assigned at birth, as it were. So in their template, for example, in front of Sarah McBride, it will say Mr. Sarah McBride. I think was the compromise that they came up with.
And look, I get it's a slippery slope, and it's look, I'm not an expert. All I know is that if there's an opportunity for me not to be nasty or for me to accept someone when it's not going to hurt anyone else, then I will do that every single day of the week. Every day of the week, I will accept someone for who they are. And if they want me to call them something different and it doesn't impact me or children or anyone else, then I will do that every day of the week. And I may not agree with it. I may think it's silly. It doesn't matter. There is enough hurt, pain, suffering in the world. I don't need to inflict it on anyone else when there is no consequence for me doing so. So that is my take on that. I think everyone is different. We all have our things. I'm not saying that, we need to change our lives to cater, but I think that when it's easy to be respectful, I will always choose to be respectful and accept anyone however they are as long as they are not hurting anyone else or trying to convince our children to take a similar path or trying to push their beliefs onto others. But in most situations, when I can show respect and accept people, I will do that every day of the week because I'm a kind person and I want people to feel good and I want people to feel nice and I want people to feel the way that we all should feel and that most of us have experienced the opposite and it's not nice.
Okay, and I just want to be respectful of your time, and I want to ask you one last question. You're clearly a very high-powered individual, and you're dedicated to being there for your daughter and trying to balance that with your career. In the United States, there's this whole current debate over the role and the seeming conflict between feminism and what's called like trad life. So how do you view conservatism
Can you
and
explain that to
feminism?
me? What is trad? Oh my God, I'm so old. I don't even know what that is.
So trad life is
Oh, the
typically
trad wife, like the wife of a gangster or something, is it?
it's not the wife of a gangster. It's a bunch of social media influencers will be typified by being like hyper feminine, talking about their role
Yes,
as
like
mothers.
cooking and cleaning for the husband and housewife. Yes, okay.
Yes. So there was a recent article that was lambasting a whole slew of people, and some people were taking issue with that because the people they were taking issue with were Brett Cooper and Candace Owens and a bunch and the Conservator, which is a conservative feminist magazine. And they're like, you just picked the worst people because all these people have full-time jobs and are balancing everything. But there's also that general trend. So I'm wondering, how do you view being a feminine person, but also working and being a professional?
Yeah, I think it's another fascinating space, isn't it? Look, I think it's very similar to my last answer in that I've never considered myself, and I used to get attacked for I was the first woman in Australia to host different sporting TV shows, so it obviously it was very newsworthy, it was a very big deal. A lot of the first jobs I had as the first woman to host people's favorite sports shows when I'd never played the sport myself. And I would say, but I'm not a raging feminist. I don't feel like I've never felt less or never felt like I missed out on things because I was a woman. So I've never, and people would sometimes be a little bit critical of me. I think the reason I would say I'm not a raging feminist is the way that I've seen feminism work over the years has not necessarily been to the benefit of women. I've seen many detrimental elements. So in some ways that word is a bit tarnished to me. I think being a mother and taking pride and you being in a position where that can be the only existence you have and that fills your cup and your heart, that is a wonderful thing. I sometimes wish that I had less need for professional pursuits. Sometimes I feel like, life would be a bit simple. Like I look at my sibling and she's a lawyer. She was graduated top of her class. She's got honors at Duke's Law School, admitted to the bar in America, then came back to Australia. Super smart. If she could just be a full-time mum and stay at home, she would be in a second. For me, that's just that wouldn't fill my cup. Now, being a mum comes first, but I think it's all about choice. I think if you are not hurting anyone and you're in a position where you can be exactly who you want to be, whether that's a mother, a high flying career woman, there's no judgment from me. I couldn't care less as long as you're happy, as long as as long as if you've got kids, you're being a good mother to them. A lot of people don't have a choice. There's this whole thing, Betty at blah blah drops her kids off at 6 a.m. and picks them up at 6 p.m. from daycare, and she doesn't have a choice. She's paying. I think it's easy to judge, but I think each to their own. Whatever works. I couldn't cook to save myself. I don't think I've ironed in about 20 years. I would not have ironed a piece of clothing in 20 years. I am unique in a million different ways. I don't fit into any particular category, but I know that I love my daughter more than life itself, and I do anything for her. And every fight that I take on, even at the moment, I look at, when I was hosting rugby league and talking about blokes' groins at 11 p.m. on a Friday night, like that's not changing the world, right? Like at least now when I'm, I've put her to bed and I'm sitting up, at midnight to interview Boris Johnson or to interview a rabbi or to write something I hope will be powerful and will resonate. I know that every word of that is to try and build a better future for her. What I love about my existence at the moment, I head over to the States next week to New York and to LA. And that's hard. Leaving her is so hard. I already have this sick mother guilt feeling, but I know it's for her. So I think being a passionate mother and wife can look different for every single person. It doesn't mean you're any less or any more than anyone else.
Thank you so much for coming on. I don't want to take up any more of your time. It was really nice
I mean,
speaking to you.
7 minutes, mate. You might have like honors and passed your law degree or whatever it is, but you can't count.
I told my cousins math is not my strong suit. I tapped out at AP calculus in high school.
No, I love it. I really enjoyed this. And thank you. You asked brilliant questions. And yeah, I can't wait to watch the whole thing. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you guys so much for joining what was a very fun episode of 7 Minute Expert. Please make sure to like and subscribe. I'm Gideon Askowitz, and this is 7 Minute Expert.